In a room lit only by the dim light of a lamp, Edward finds an ancient letter that reveals a family secret. In the letter, a revelation that makes his legs tremble. On a pleasant autumn morning, Edward McLean was leaving his modest home in Charlottesville, a city that breathes history at every corner of its cobbled streets and colonial buildings. Edward, a high school history teacher with a palpable passion for the past, had inherited not only his grandparents' home, but also a fascination for the deep roots his family had laid in that region of Virginia. While he organized the attic, a task repeatedly postponed since the death of his father, Edward came across an old wooden box, covered in dust and filled with old photographs, faded letters, and other familiar artifacts. As she carefully flipped through each item, her curiosity was fed by each piece of paper she touched, as if each was a fragment of a forgotten puzzle. Among these treasures, a letter caught his attention. The calligraphy was elegant, but the lines were blurred by the marks of time. Edward read aloud, a way to bring the words to life. "My dear Jonathan, I hope this one finds you well, despite the turbulent circumstances. We have stood firm here in Charlottesville, and though the war preoccupies us daily, we hold the hope that peace will prevail." Intrigued, Edward researched more about the sender of the letter, discovering it to be his great-great-grandfather, James A. Monroe, who lived during the American Civil War. However, what really surprised Edward was not only the historical period, but the mention of James being directly involved in significant events of that time, something completely unknown to him and his family. Determined to unravel more about this connection, Edward began a journey that would take him to local libraries, historical archives, and eventually to contacts with other genealogists. At each step, he documented his findings, sharing them with his students and encouraging them to explore their own heritage. "Class, what I found is not just the story of my family, but a piece of our American history," he explained one morning while showing a copy of the letter to the students. "Each family has a unique history, and each of these stories is a thread in the great tapestry of our nation." The students' response was one of admiration and curiosity, with many beginning to question their own origins and how they could investigate their family stories. Edward felt a deep sense of satisfaction at seeing his passion for the past inspire the next generation. As Edward's research progressed, he often found himself in deep conversations with his mother, Elizabeth, who was also interested in the findings. On a quiet afternoon, sitting in the garden with tea, Elizabeth shared her own memories. "You know, your grandfather always said there was more to our story than the eye can see. I never completely understood what he meant, but I think you're finally figuring it out," she said, smiling at Edward with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. These conversations and discoveries not only enriched Edward's understanding of his heritage, but also strengthened the bonds between him and his mother, bringing new layers of meaning to the stories she had passed to him since childhood. With every document found and every story discovered, Edward was not only building his family history, but also reconnecting with his roots in a way he never imagined possible. The discovery of his great-great-grandfather, a man of principle and courage, redefined his perception of himself and his role as an educator and guardian of the past. As autumn gave way to winter, the long nights offered Edward the perfect time for his genealogical research. His attic had turned into a sanctuary of forgotten stories, lit only by a table lamp and the faint glow of the moon seeping through the old windows. It was a particularly cold December night when Edward found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon hidden in the back of an old document drawer. He carefully untied the ribbon, feeling the weight of the story in the palms of his hands. The letters were correspondence between his great-great-grandfather, James, and a renowned politician of the time, whose name resonated in the history books, an influential leader in discussions about the abolition of slavery. The revelation was unexpected. Edward's family always considered themselves simple farmers from Southern Virginia, without significant involvement in national political or social issues. Each letter revealed more about James's role in that critical period. Edward read excerpts from the letters to his mother, Elizabeth, during one of his weekly dinner meetings. "Mother, hear this," said he, the trembling voice of wonder and surprise. "Dear Mr. Harrison, the issues we discussed are not just politics, but morality and humanity. We must, as a nation, rise above the injustices that stain our collective consciousness. James was not only aware, but actively involved in the struggle for freedom and equality. Elizabeth listened, captivated and visibly moved, realizing that her family's story was deeper and more complex than she had ever imagined. "I knew his great-grandfather was a man of principle. He would have been proud to know that his beliefs were not forgotten." Delving further into the investigations, Edward decided to visit the local university, where experts in Civil War history could help him better contextualize the findings. With the help of a university professor, Dr. Samuel Beck, Edward began to map the movements of his great-great-grandfather and the influence he could have exerted on local and national events. Dr. Beck, equally fascinated, helped Edward access military records and documents of the time, which confirmed James's participation in conventions and secret meetings on abolition. "Not only have you found a family treasure, Mr. McLean, but also a significant piece of our historical puzzle. This is a document that deserves to be studied and preserved," explained Dr. Beck, encouraging Edward to publish his findings in an academic journal. Each discovery brought a mixture of pride and responsibility. Edward felt he was not only rediscovering his family's history, but also redefining his own identity and the legacy he wished to leave to his students and the community. In a presentation at the school, where parents and community members were invited, Edward shared his exciting journey of discovery. The auditorium was silent, hanging on every word as he presented copies of the letters, photos of James, and a map detailing the locations of significant events where his great-great-grandfather had been. These are not just letters on a page. They are the voices of the past, crying out for justice, equality, and change. By honoring these voices, we can learn from them, he said, his voice full of passion and conviction, deeply touching the hearts of everyone in the audience. The evening ended with warm applause and many questions from the audience, demonstrating the profound impact that Edward's personal story had on the community. Conversations about justice, history, and identity spread that night, with many expressing a desire to explore their own genealogies. Edward felt a deep gratitude and a sense of purpose revitalized. Not only had he discovered the story of his great-great-grandfather, but through it he inspired an entire community to look to the past to better understand the present and shape a more conscious and inclusive future. The morning after his performance, Edward awoke with a sense of renewal. The conversations of the night before, full of curiosity and admiration for the story of his great-great-grandfather, reverberated in his mind. But it was an email from a University of Virginia scholar that added a new level of meaning to her research. She was interested in collaborating with Edward to explore more about the abolitionist networks of the time, suggesting that James's influence could be even more comprehensive than imagined. The idea that his personal research could contribute to academic understanding of the history of the Civil War ignited a new passion in Edward. He began attending conferences and seminars, sharing his findings and learning from other historians. At each event, Edward felt more connected to the historical community, an extension of his own family, united by a common desire to unravel and preserve the past. At home, discussions about James Monroe became a family hangout. Elizabeth, increasingly fascinated by the revelations, began to recover old stories she had heard from her parents and grandparents, now realizing the broader context of these accounts. Edward's visits to his parents became storytelling sessions, where old documents were examined with new respect and curiosity. One evening, while leafing through a family album, Elizabeth pointed to a faded photograph of an elegant woman holding an open book in her lap. "This was her great-grandmother Eleanor," said Elizabeth. "She's always been described as a woman ahead of her time, very involved in social issues. Now I see she must have shared James' ideals." This historical bond inspired Edward to organize a larger gathering, a family reunion where he planned to reveal to everyone the full story of James. Preparation for the event became a family unity project, with relatives from various parts of the country sending information, photographs, and even family objects related to the Civil War era. When the big day came, Edward's house was full. Distant relatives, some of whom he had never met in person, gathered in the backyard, sharing stories and building a new sense of collective identity. Edward prepared a detailed presentation, beginning with the initial discovery of the letters and expanding to include the many contributions of other family members over the years. We are all connected, not just by our blood, but by our shared history of courage and conviction, Edward began, his firm voice resounding under the awning mounted for the occasion. Each generation passed on not just genes, but a legacy of values. Values that James and Eleanor lived intensely. Today, as I look at each of you, I see these values reflected in your faces and your stories. The impact of this connection was palpable. Conversations emerged in every corner as family members compared notes, promising to keep in touch and continue Edward's research. The meeting became more than a celebration. It was a revival of family ties and a renewed commitment to the memory and ideals of the ancestors. In the following months, Edward collaborated with the University of Virginia scholar to publish an article detailing his findings. The article not only highlighted the historical importance of James Monroe, but also encouraged others to explore their own family archives, suggesting that each family could have untold stories waiting to be discovered. Edward also continued to use his research in his classes, inspiring his students to consider history not as a series of dates and events, but as a tapestry of human lives and decisions that shape the world we live in. He organized class projects where students were encouraged to interview their family members, learn about their past, and present their stories on an annual Inheritance Day at school. Edward's journey transformed not only his vision of himself and his family, but also his approach to education and community. Through the story of James Monroe, he rediscovered the importance of knowing our roots, not only to understand who we are, but also to shape who we want to be. As summer approached, Edward's research and recent family reunion had woven new narratives into the fabric of the Charlottesville community. The impact of these discoveries was not limited only to family members, but began to influence the entire city. The story of James Monroe and his contribution to American history was becoming an integral part of the local curriculum, with Edward being asked to speak at community and school events throughout the region. At one of these events, on the anniversary of emancipation, Edward was invited to be the keynote speaker at a ceremony in the city's historic center. The square was adorned with flags and banners, and a diverse audience, composed of locals, students, and historians, had gathered under the hot June sun. When we begin to explore the history of our ancestors, we never know what kind of stories will emerge from the shadows of time, began Edward, his clear and firm voice capturing the attention of the crowd. What we find can challenge us, can elevate us, or, as in the case of my family, can do both. He proceeded, detailing not only the findings about his great-great-grandfather, but also how these revelations had transformed his own life and that of his family. This journey was not just about discovering the past, but about understanding how that past shapes our present and our future. The presentation was followed by a panel discussion, where the community was encouraged to share their own stories. The event turned into a vibrant celebration of all heritage, highlighting the rich cultural tapestry that made up the city. In parallel, Edward and his family decided to establish a foundation dedicated to preserving local history and historical education. The Monroe Foundation, as it was called, quickly gained support from various educational and historical institutions, providing resources for other families to research their genealogies and share their unique stories. In the personal aspect, the discovery strengthened the ties between Edward and his mother, Elizabeth. They spent many afternoons together, organizing documents and photographs for the foundation, each item telling a part of their family history. On one of these afternoons, while organizing an exhibition of old photographs, Elizabeth reflected on the impact of the findings. "You know, Edward, I always knew you were meant to do something great, something more than just teach history. You're bringing history to life, making it relevant and personal for so many," she said, with a mix of pride and emotion. Edward, feeling the depth of his words, replied, "Mother, it is true that I am trying to make a difference, but all this began with the family, with the stories you and Dad told me. This is our joint legacy, a legacy we can now share with the world." Edward's story ends in a grand annual family celebration, now a fixed event on the Monroe Foundation calendar. The celebration was not just a gathering, but a living conference of stories, where family members from across the country came to share updates on their own genealogical research, further enriching the family mosaic. That year's closing event was particularly exciting. Edward presented a memorial project to James Monroe and others who, like him, played crucial but undocumented roles in the history of the Civil War. The project was welcomed with enthusiasm, with many community members and family members contributing ideas and financial support. "We're building something that will last for generations," Edward told the group gathered under the large trees of the local park, the leaves whispering with echoes of the past. Not just a stone monument, but a monument of memory and understanding. Edward's story is a testament to the power of family history not only to connect people, but to inspire entire communities to look back with respect and the future with hope. Through his journey, he not only found answers about his ancestors, but he discovered a new way of living his own life, redefining what it means to be an educator, historian, and above all, a dedicated member of his community. If you like this exciting story, help us by leaving your like and subscribing to our channel. Until the next story.